The roses in my sister's wedding bouquet were wilting, their white petals edged with brown. 3 hours we'd been standing in this receiving line, and still I wasn't allowed to hold her baby. Emma clutched little Sophia against her chest like she was shielding her from contamination, from me. The photographer kept positioning family shots, and every time Emma would whisper something to Mom, and somehow I'd end up cropped out or moved to the very edge of the frame. Maybe Zara could watch the gift table instead, Emma suggested when Aunt Linda asked why I wasn't in any photos with the baby. Her voice carried that particular tone of dismissal I'd heard since childhood, sweet on the surface, poisonous underneath. She's so good with organizing things. Organizing things. Like I was some kind of administrative assistant at her wedding instead of her sister. The guests nodded politely, but I caught the sideways glances. Here was the family failure again, relegated to gift duty while the golden child basked in matrimonial glory. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen windows of our childhood home in Millfield, casting shadows across the worn linoleum floor where I'd spent countless hours helping Mom with dinner prep while Emma practiced piano in the living room. Those musical scales had been the soundtrack to my invisibility, each note a reminder that some of us were born to perform while others were meant to watch from the wings. I adjusted my bridesmaid dress, a pale lavender number that Emma had chosen specifically because she knew it made my complexion look sallow. Every detail of this wedding had been calculated to highlight her perfection and diminish everything else. The dress, the flowers, even my placement at the ceremony, standing behind her cousin Melissa instead of next to her as maid of honor. That position had gone to her college roommate, someone she'd known for 4 years, instead of her sister who'd shared a bedroom with her for 18. "Zara, the gifts are getting mixed up," Mom called from across the reception hall. Her voice held that familiar note of exasperation, like I was perpetually disappointing her just by existing. "Can you please keep better track?" I walked over to the elegantly draped table where wedding presents sat in neat rows, each one tagged with a small card. Nothing was mixed up. Everything was exactly where it should be, organized by arrival time and cross-referenced with the guest list I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting. But accuracy had never been the point with my family. The point was always finding something wrong, some small way to remind me that I wasn't quite measuring up. Emma glided over in her $1,000 gown, baby Sophia sleeping peacefully in her arms. At 6 months old, my niece was the kind of beautiful that stopped conversations. Dark hair like silk, perfect little fingers that curled around anything they touched, and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. She was everything pure and innocent in this world, and watching Emma use her as a prop in her ongoing performance of perfection made my chest tight with protective fury. "Oh, good, you're managing the gifts," Emma said, not looking at me directly. She'd perfected this technique years ago, addressing me while gazing slightly over my shoulder, as if I were a servant who didn't quite deserve eye contact. James and I were worried about leaving them unattended. James. Her new husband was a decent enough man, worked in commercial real estate, drove a sensible sedan, and had the kind of bland handsomeness that photographed well. He treated Emma like a queen, which she expected, and me like furniture, which she encouraged. During their engagement party, I'd overheard him asking who I was, despite having met me 6 times. "Everything's under control," I said, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the tablecloth. My voice came out steadier than I felt, a skill I'd developed over years of practice. Never let them see you break. Never give them the satisfaction. Emma's expression shifted slightly, that micro frown she got when something didn't go according to her script. She'd been hoping I'd fumble, drop something, create a small disaster she could sigh about later when telling people how difficult it was to have an unreliable sister. But I'd learned long ago that the best way to survive in this family was to be absolutely flawless at everything I was allowed to do, even if those things were considered beneath everyone else's notice. "Well," she said, adjusting Sophia's tiny white dress, "just make sure nothing gets damaged. Some of these gifts are quite expensive." I nodded, biting back the response that rose in my throat, like the crystal vase from Aunt Linda that I'd specifically wrapped in extra padding and positioned away from the table edge, or the silver serving set from James's parents that I had personally carried from the car to prevent the catering staff from handling it. Every precaution had been mine to take, every detail mine to manage, but the credit would somehow flow to Emma's excellent planning and oversight. The reception continued around us, a swirl of white linens and champagne toasts. Emma's college friends clustered near the bar, sharing stories about her sorority days and her internship at a prestigious marketing firm. The internship she'd gotten through Dad's connections, the same connections that somehow never materialized when I was job hunting after graduation. Not that anyone mentioned these details, Emma's success was always presented as purely meritorious, evidence of her natural superiority rather than systematic advantage. "She's so good, Mother," I heard someone whisper near the cake table. "And so young, too. Really has her life together."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 26 wasn't that young for motherhood, but Emma had always been celebrated for reaching normal milestones. When she graduated college on time, it was an achievement worthy of family celebration. When I graduated a semester early with honors, it was barely acknowledged. When she got engaged after dating James for 2 years, it was romantic destiny. When I'd been single for the same length of time, it was a cause for concerned family meetings about my social development. The afternoon wore on with painful predictability. Emma's friends took turns holding Sophia, passing her around like a beloved prize, while I remained stationed at my gift table, watching from a distance. Every time someone new took the baby, Emma would hover anxiously, offering instructions about supporting her head and watching her movements. But when I approached during a quiet moment, she'd suddenly remember something urgent that required Sophia's immediate return to her arms. "Maybe later, Zara," she'd say, pulling the baby closer. "She's been fussy with new people today." This was a lie. Sophia had been perfectly content with everyone who'd held her, smiling and gurgling happily even with complete strangers. But Emma's lies were always delivered with such conviction that questioning them felt churlish. She had a gift for rewriting reality in real time, crafting narratives that painted her as the reasonable one and everyone else as slightly unreliable. As the evening shadows lengthened, guests began filtering out, offering congratulations and collecting their party favors. Emma had chosen expensive little boxes of imported chocolates, another detail I'd researched and ordered but she'd taken credit for. The cleanup would fall to me, too, I knew, along with returning any leftover decorations and settling final payments with vendors. The glamorous parts of hosting belonged to Emma, but the logistics always somehow became my responsibility. "Zara, can you start packing up the gifts?" Mom appeared beside me, her voice carrying that familiar tone of mild irritation, as if I hadn't already been mentally cataloging which ones needed special handling and which could be safely stacked. "Emma and James need to leave soon for their honeymoon preparations." Of course they did. A week in Tuscany, staying at a villa James's family owned, while I spent my vacation days managing the aftermath of their celebration. I'd be the one coordinating gift storage, sending thank you card reminders, and handling any vendor issues that arose. But that was my role in this family, the one who handled details so everyone else could float through life unburdened by mundane concerns. I began carefully wrapping each gift in tissue paper, creating an inventory as I worked. Emma appeared beside me as I finished with the larger items, Sophia drowsing against her shoulder. This close, I could see the baby's perfect little face, her tiny fingers that moved occasionally in sleep. She smelled like powder and that indefinable sweetness that all babies carried, pure and innocent and completely unaware of the family dynamics swirling around her. "She looks just like you did at that age," I said softly, hoping this might be a bridge between us, sisters sharing a moment over the next generation of our family. Emma's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everyone says she looks like James's family," she replied, adjusting her hold on Sophia. "The nose especially. Very distinct features on his side." Another rejection, swift and automatic. Even my attempt to connect through shared family resemblance was somehow inappropriate. I turned back to the gifts, finishing my inventory in silence, while Emma supervised with visible impatience. Nothing I did would ever be fast enough or careful enough to meet her standards. standards that seemed to rise precisely to remain just out of my reach. As the evening shadows lengthened, guests began filtering out, offering congratulations and collecting their party favors. Emma had chosen expensive little boxes of imported chocolates, another detail I'd researched and ordered, but she'd taken credit for. The cleanup would fall to me too, I knew, along with returning any leftover decorations and settling final payments with vendors. The glamorous parts of hosting belonged to Emma, but the logistics always somehow became my responsibility. "Zara, can you start packing up the gifts?" Mom appeared beside me, her voice carrying that familiar tone of mild irritation, as if I hadn't already been mentally cataloging which ones needed special handling and which could be safely stacked. "Emma and James need to leave soon for their honeymoon preparations." Of course they did. A week in Tuscany, staying at a villa James's family owned, while I spent my vacation days managing the aftermath of their celebration. I'd be the one coordinating gift storage, sending thank you card reminders, and handling any vendor issues that arose. But that was my role in this family, the one who handled details so everyone else could float through life unburdened by mundane concerns. I began carefully wrapping each gift in tissue paper, creating an inventory as I worked. Emma appeared beside me as I finished with the larger items, Sophia drowsing against her shoulder. This close, I could see the baby's perfect little face, her tiny fingers that moved occasionally in sleep. She smelled like powder and that indefinable sweetness that all babies carried, pure and innocent, and completely unaware of the family dynamics swirling around her. "She looks just like you did at that age," I said softly, hoping this might be a bridge between us, sisters sharing a moment over the next generation of our family. Emma's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everyone says she looks like James's family," she replied, adjusting her hold on Sophia. "The nose especially. Very distinct features on his side." Another rejection, swift and automatic. Even my attempt to connect through shared family resemblance was somehow inappropriate. I turned back to the gifts, finishing my inventory in silence, while Emma supervised with visible impatience. Nothing I did would ever be fast enough or careful enough to meet her standards. Standards that seemed to rise precisely to remain just out of my reach. As the last guests departed and the catering staff began breaking down tables, I found myself alone in the increasingly empty hall, surrounded by boxes and tissue paper. Emma had left an hour earlier, whisked away by James to their hotel suite where they'd spend their final night before flying to Italy. The baby had gone with them, of course, along with a carefully packed diaper bag I'd organized that morning, while Emma got her hair touched up. Mom appeared from the kitchen where she'd been settling accounts with the caterer. Her face bore that expression of tired satisfaction that came after successfully hosting a major family event. Everything had gone perfectly, at least by the metrics that mattered to her. Emma had looked radiant, the ceremony had been flawless, and the reception had unfolded without any social embarrassments. My efficient management of logistics ensured nothing went wrong, though that contribution would be forgotten by morning. "Well, that was beautiful," she said, surveying the remnants of the celebration. "Emma looked absolutely perfect, didn't she?" I nodded, continuing to pack gifts into protective boxes. Perfect was Emma's specialty, the role she'd cultivated since childhood, and that our family had eagerly embraced. She was the daughter who reflected well on everyone, who made safe choices and achieved predictable milestones, and never caused anyone worry or confusion. I was the other one, the variable that never quite fit the equation, the daughter who required management rather than celebration. "And little Sophia," Mom continued, her voice softening with grandmother's affection. "Such a precious baby. Emma's going to be a wonderful mother." This was stated as a fact, not an opinion. Emma's excellence at motherhood was assumed, preordained, never to be questioned. She'd read all the right books, bought all the approved products, and surrounded herself with appropriate support systems. Her success was inevitable because she deserved it, because she was the kind of person who naturally excelled at important things. I finished loading the last box into my car, each gift carefully cushioned and labeled for easy identification later. Tomorrow I'd deliver everything to Emma and James's new house, arranging items in their designated rooms and probably staying to help with initial setup. It was understood that I'd handle these follow-up tasks, just as I'd handled the pre-wedding coordination and day of logistics.
My competence in practical matters was acknowledged, even valued, but it was service competence, not leadership competence. I was useful, not essential. The drive home through empty suburban streets gave me time to think, something I'd been avoiding all day. In 12 hours, I'd be back at work,
settling into the rhythm of my real life, the one my family knew nothing about. They saw me as perpetually struggling, professionally adrift, personally unsuccessful. A woman approaching 30 with no husband, no children, no obvious achievements they could brag about at dinner parties. What they didn't see was the security clearance badge I kept in a locked box in my bedroom dresser. What they didn't know was that my administrative job involved coordinating intelligence operations across 3 continents, that my supposed failure to launch had actually been a deliberate choice to serve something larger than social expectations. They thought I pushed papers in a government office, and I let them believe it, because the truth was classified at levels they couldn't imagine. But tonight, driving through the darkness with the back seat full of wedding gifts, I felt the weight of living 2 lives. At work, I was Major Zara Chen, respected for my analytical skills and trusted with information that could shape international relations. At family gatherings, I was just Zara, the disappointing sister who couldn't manage to find a husband or achieve anything worth celebrating. The contrast was becoming harder to bear, especially now that Sophia was part of the equation. That baby represented everything pure and hopeful in our family, but she was being raised in the same environment that had systematically diminished me for decades. Would Emma teach her daughter that some people mattered more than others? That success came in only certain acceptable forms? Would Sophia grow up believing her aunt was a failure, unworthy of respect or consideration? The thought made my chest tight with protective instinct. Sophia deserved better than the casual cruelty that had shaped my childhood, better than a family that measured worth through narrow metrics and found most people wanting. She deserved to know that strength came in many forms, that service to others could be its own reward, and that the most important victories were often invisible to outsiders. I pulled into my driveway, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood that I'd bought with cash 3 years ago. My family thought I was renting an apartment, living paycheck to paycheck like someone who couldn't manage adult responsibilities. They didn't know about the investment portfolio, the savings account, the financial security I'd built through careful planning and disciplined spending. These weren't the kind of achievements they understood or valued, so I kept them private, another part of my hidden life. Inside, I changed out of the lavender bridesmaid dress and into comfortable civilian clothes, then poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my living room thinking about the day. Tomorrow, Emma and James would fly to Italy for their honeymoon, leaving Sophia with James's parents in their suburban mansion. The following week, they'd return to settle into married life, establishing routines and rhythms that would shape their daughter's earliest memories. I wouldn't be part of those routines, wouldn't have regular access to my niece unless Emma specifically invited me. And those invitations would be rare, carefully controlled, designed to reinforce the family hierarchy rather than build genuine relationships. I'd be allowed to babysit in emergencies, permitted to buy gifts on appropriate occasions, tolerated at family gatherings where my presence was necessary for appearances. But I'd also be watching from a distance, ready to protect Sophia in ways her parents couldn't imagine. Because my real job, the one my family knew nothing about, had taught me that danger came in forms most people never considered. Threats weren't always obvious, and the people best positioned to defend against them were often the ones nobody suspected were capable of extraordinary action. The wine was smooth and warm, helping ease the tension that had been building in my shoulders all day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh intelligence reports that needed analysis, operational decisions that could affect lives around the world. But tonight, I sat in my quiet house, surrounded by my hidden life, and planned how to be the aunt Sophia deserved, even if her mother would never let me be the aunt I wanted to be. The last thing I did before going to bed was check my secure phone, scrolling through messages that had accumulated during the wedding. Routine updates, status reports, coordination requests from field teams operating in places my family couldn't find on a map. This was my real world, the one where my decisions mattered and my expertise was valued, where failure meant actual consequences rather than just disappointed sighs at family dinners.
But it was also a world I'd chosen to keep separate from the people I loved, including a beautiful baby who would grow up never knowing her aunt had the power to move mountains on her behalf. That separation was becoming harder to maintain, especially now that Emma had weaponized motherhood as another way to exclude me from family importance. I fell asleep thinking about Sophia's perfect little face and about the invisible forces that would always be working to keep her safe, whether her mother appreciated them or not. Some productions were meant to remain unseen. Some guardians were meant to operate from the shadows, but that didn't make them any less real or any less devoted to the people they served. The morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve in ways my family would never understand. But for now, I rested in the knowledge that love took many forms, and sometimes the deepest love was the kind that asked nothing in return, except the chance to keep protecting from a distance. Emma might call me a worthless failure, might exclude me from family photos and meaningful moments with my niece, but she had no idea what kind of failure she was dealing with, or what kind of resources I could mobilize if Sophia ever needed protection beyond what conventional family support could provide. That knowledge would have to be enough, at least for now, because some truths were too dangerous to share, even with the people you loved most. And some sisters were meant to guard rather than shine, to serve rather than perform, to love fiercely and silently from whatever distance was required. The wedding was over, but the real story was just beginning. The alarm pierced through my sleep at 4:30 a.m., 3 days after Emma's wedding. I rolled out of bed with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding me through the morning routine I'd perfected over 8 years of service. Coffee, protein bar, quick shower, then into the uniform that my family had never seen me wear. The drive to Langley took 40 minutes in pre-dawn traffic, giving me time to mentally shift from Zara the disappointing sister to Major Chen, intelligence analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency. The parking garage beneath Building 6 was already half full when I arrived. Night shift personnel heading home crossed paths with day shift arrivals, a choreographed changing of the guard that happened every 12 hours, 365 days a year. I badged through 3 separate security checkpoints, each one scanning different biometrics before reaching the elevator that would take me down to sub-level 3, where my real work happened. The SCIF, Sensitive Compartmentalized Information Facility, hummed with quiet intensity. Banks of monitors cast blue light across rows of workstations, each one manned by analysts whose existence was unknown to their own families. We were ghosts in the machine of national security, processing intelligence that shaped global events while our loved ones assumed we filed paperwork in generic government buildings. My workstation occupied a corner position, 3 curved monitors displaying encrypted feeds from 12 time zones: Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, each region requiring constant monitoring for emerging threats. The coffee here tasted like burnt metal, but it kept me alert during 16-hour days that officially didn't exist on any schedule my family might inquire about. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez appeared beside my desk at 0600 sharp, carrying 2 cups of the terrible coffee and a manila folder stamped with classification markings that would make a civilian's head spin.
Sarah was career military, 22 years in intelligence, with the kind of focused competence that had earned her respect from every analyst in the building. She also happened to be the only person at work who knew about my family situation, having witnessed me fielding condescending phone calls from Emma during our deployment to Somalia 3 years earlier. "Wedding recovery?" she asked, settling into the guest chair beside my workstation. Her tone was carefully neutral, but I caught the underlying sympathy. Sarah had been through her own family complications. A messy divorce from a husband who'd resented her long deployments and classified work schedule. "Something like that," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The manila folder in her hands bore the kind of classification stamps that meant my day was about to get significantly more complicated. "What's the situation?" She opened the folder, revealing satellite imagery and threat assessments that immediately commanded my full attention. The photos showed a compound in rural Kazakhstan,
Seemingly unremarkable buildings surrounded by farmland and scattered outbuildings. But the technical analysis revealed electromagnetic signatures consistent with advanced communications equipment and irregular heat patterns suggesting underground facilities. Asset in Almaty reported unusual activity 3 weeks ago, Sarah explained, sliding the photos across my desk. Foreign nationals arriving with diplomatic passports, but staying in private facilities instead of embassy housing. Cash transactions for industrial equipment that doesn't match any declared agricultural or mining operations. I studied the imagery, noting details that would be invisible to untrained eyes. Vehicle patterns that suggested security protocols rather than farming schedules. Building modifications that looked like defensive preparations. Personnel movement patterns that spoke of military training rather than civilian occupation. How solid is the asset? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Assets who reported this level of detail were usually long-term embeds with proven track records, the kind of intelligence sources who'd been developed over years of patient cultivation. 15-year relationship, never provided bad intelligence, Sarah confirmed. But this is the first time he's requested immediate extraction. Says he's been made and has maybe 72 hours before his cover is blown completely. That changed everything. Asset extraction was delicate under the best circumstances, requiring coordination between multiple agencies and precise timing to avoid international incidents. When the asset was reporting on facilities that might pose direct threats to American interests, the stakes became exponentially higher. What's the working theory on the facility? I asked, already pulling up additional databases to cross-reference the satellite imagery with known hostile operations. Sarah's expression tightened. Chemical weapons production, possibly bioweapons. The equipment purchases match precursor materials for VX gas synthesis, and the personnel include at least 3 individuals with documented connections to the Syrian weapons program. My coffee suddenly tasted even more metallic. Chemical weapons in the hands of non-state actors represented one of our highest priority threat scenarios, the kind of nightmare that kept intelligence analysts awake at night and drove policy decisions at the highest levels of government. If the facility was operational, it could produce enough toxic agents to kill thousands of people in a major city. Timeline for action? I asked, though I was already mentally calculating the operational requirements. Asset extraction from hostile territory, while simultaneously gathering intelligence on a potential WMD facility, would require resources and coordination that took weeks to arrange under normal circumstances. The extraction team is wheels up in 6 hours, Sarah said quietly, but they're flying blind on facility security, personnel strength, and defensive capabilities. We need actionable intelligence before they cross into Kazakhstani airspace, or we could be sending them into a massacre. 6 hours to analyze a facility that had been under development for months, using limited satellite imagery and fragments of intelligence from a compromised source. It was the kind of impossible timeline that defined our work, where global security hung on the ability of analysts to synthesize incomplete information under extreme pressure. I cracked my knuckles and pulled my keyboards closer, settling into the focused state that came naturally after years of practice. The outside world faded away as I dove into the digital maze of intelligence databases, cross-referencing personnel files with financial records, tracking equipment purchases through shell companies and front organizations, building a picture of the threat from scattered pieces of classified information. The first breakthrough came 2 hours later, when facial recognition software matched one of the facility personnel to a Pakistani engineer who'd worked on nuclear weapons before disappearing from Islamabad 18 months ago. The second came from financial analysis, showing money transfers from accounts linked to Iranian intelligence services to Kazakhstani agricultural cooperatives that existed only on paper. By 1,000 hours, I had constructed a comprehensive threat assessment that painted a terrifying picture. The facility wasn't just producing chemical weapons, it was developing delivery systems designed to disperse toxic agents through urban water supplies. The target locations, based on intercepted communications and logistical patterns, appeared to include major American cities on the eastern seaboard. Sarah appeared at my shoulder as I was printing the final assessment, her face grim as she read the conclusions over my shoulder. "How confident are you in these projections?" she asked. Though we both knew the answer, intelligence analysis was never about absolute certainty. It was about probability assessments based on available evidence. 85% confidence on weapons production, 70% on delivery system development, 90% on American targets, I replied, organizing the documents for immediate distribution to operational planners. The asset extraction needs to happen, but the facility requires immediate neutralization. She nodded grimly, already reaching for the secure phone that would connect her to the Pentagon's Crisis Management Center. Within minutes, my analysis would be briefed to generals and cabinet secretaries, influencing decisions that could prevent thousands of casualties or potentially start armed conflicts with multiple nations. The extraction team launched on schedule, 12 hours ahead of their original timeline thanks to the intelligence package I'd developed. I spent the next 18 hours monitoring their progress through encrypted communications, providing real-time analysis as they penetrated Kazakhstani airspace and approached the target facility. The asset was retrieved successfully, along with hard drives containing detailed information about the weapons program and its intended targets. The facility itself was neutralized by precision airstrikes 48 hours later, officially attributed to a natural gas explosion that killed several foreign technicians and destroyed agricultural equipment. The chemical weapons precursors were incinerated in the blast, eliminating the immediate threat while maintaining plausible deniability for American involvement. My phone buzzed with a text message as I was writing the final mission report, Emma's name appearing on the screen with a photo attachment.
The image showed her and James boarding their flight to Italy, both of them grinning happily while baby Sophia slept in her carrier. The caption read, "Off to our honeymoon. Thanks for handling the gift situation. Hope it wasn't too much trouble." The casual dismissiveness of that message hit me harder than it should have, coming as it did after 36 hours of work that had literally prevented mass casualties in American cities. My family had no idea that while they were celebrating weddings and planning vacations, I was helping coordinate operations that kept them safe in their suburban bubbles. I stared at the photo for a long moment, studying Sophia's peaceful sleeping face. That baby would grow up in a world where chemical weapons facilities were neutralized before they became operational threats, where potential terrorists disappeared quietly before they could execute their plans, where intelligence analysts worked around the clock to maintain the illusion that such dangers didn't exist. But she'd also grow up believing her aunt was a failure, someone who couldn't manage to achieve anything worth celebrating. The irony was almost unbearable, watching my family dismiss me while I literally helped save their lives from threats they'd never know existed. Sarah appeared beside my desk again, this time carrying commendation paperwork that would join a dozen others in my classified personnel file. "Outstanding work on the Kazakhstan analysis," she said, settling into her usual chair. "The extraction team said your facility assessment was accurate down to the guard rotation schedules." I accepted the paperwork with a tired smile, knowing it would never be seen by anyone outside the intelligence community. My family would never know about this commendation, just as they'd never known about the others I'd earned over 8 years of service. In their world, I remained professionally unsuccessful, personally unfulfilled, and generally disappointing. "Any word from the asset about other facilities?" I asked, though part of me hoped the answer was no. Each new threat meant another crisis cycle, another period of 18-hour days and constant pressure, another successful operation that would remain forever invisible to the people I was protecting. Sarah shook her head. "Clean extraction, but he's reporting that the weapons program was further along than we initially assessed. The facility we hit was one of 3 production sites, and the other 2 are located in countries where military action isn't politically feasible." That meant more analysis, more long hours spent tracking financial flows and personnel movements, more delicate coordination with foreign intelligence services who might or might not share our interests. It meant weeks or months of work that would never appear on any resume, protecting people who would never thank me because they'd never know I'd helped save their lives. My secure phone rang, displaying a number I recognized from the Pentagon's Intelligence Coordination Center. Another crisis, another impossible deadline, another chance to prove my worth to people who actually understood the value of the work I did. I answered the call with professional efficiency, already shifting back into the focused mindset that allowed me to function at peak performance under extreme pressure. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, outlining a developing situation in Eastern Europe that required immediate analysis. Another facility, another weapons program, another race against time to prevent catastrophic consequences. I accepted the assignment without hesitation, as I always did, because the alternative was unthinkable. As I hung up the phone and began accessing new databases, Emma's wedding photo remained visible on my personal phone, a reminder of the two worlds I inhabited. In one world, I was Major Chen, trusted with information that could topple governments and respected for analytical skills that had been proven under the most demanding circumstances. In the other world, I was just Zara, the sister who couldn't get her act together and needed to be managed during family events. The contrast was becoming harder to bear, especially now that Sophia was part of the equation. That beautiful baby deserved to grow up knowing the truth about strength and service, about the different ways people could contribute to making the world safer. But she'd be raised by parents who measured success through conventional metrics, who believed that invisible contributions didn't really count. I minimized Emma's photo and maximized the intelligence feeds, losing myself once again in the digital maze of threat assessment and operational planning. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, people were making decisions that could endanger thousands of lives. My job was to identify those threats and provide the information necessary to neutralize them before they became operational. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly wasn't the kind of achievement that would impress my family. But it was necessary work, performed by people who'd chosen service over recognition, effectiveness over visibility. We were the guardians in the shadows, the ones who handled the dangerous truths so others could sleep peacefully in their ignorance. 3 hours later, I had identified the Eastern European facility and traced its financial networks back to the same Iranian intelligence services that had funded the Kazakhstan operation. The pattern was becoming clear: a coordinated campaign to establish chemical weapons production in multiple countries, using agricultural cover stories and diplomatic immunity to avoid detection. My analysis triggered another extraction operation, this one coordinated with British and German intelligence services who had their own assets in the region. The mission succeeded, resulting in the capture of detailed plans for attacking European and American water supplies with weaponized toxins that could kill millions of people. But my family would never know about any of it. They'd continue to see me as the disappointing sister who worked some boring government job and couldn't manage to find a husband or have children. They'd continue to exclude me from important family moments while benefiting from the work I did to keep them safe. The secure phone rang again as I was finishing the mission report, another crisis developing in real time. I answered with the same professional efficiency, ready to dive into another impossible timeline, another chance to prevent disasters that would never make headlines because they'd been stopped before they could unfold. This was my life, this endless cycle of invisible victories and unacknowledged sacrifices. I'd chosen it deliberately, understanding the costs and accepting them as necessary for the greater good. But sometimes, looking at photos of my niece sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, I wondered what it would be like to have just one person in my family understand the real value of the work I did. The new crisis was unfolding in Southeast Asia, another weapons facility that needed immediate assessment before operational teams could be deployed. I opened fresh databases and began the familiar process of building intelligence pictures from fragments of classified information, protecting people who would never know my name or understand what I'd done on their behalf. Emma and James were probably boarding their connecting flight to Italy, excited about their honeymoon and blissfully unaware that their safety depended on people like me working around the clock to identify and neutralize threats. Sophia was sleeping in her carrier, dreaming baby dreams in a world where chemical weapons facilities were destroyed before they could produce their deadly payloads. And I was exactly where I needed to be, doing the work that mattered most, even if the people I loved most would never understand its importance. Some victories were meant to remain secret, some heroes were meant to operate from shadows, and some sisters were meant to protect rather than perform. The analysis would take another 12 hours, followed by operational briefings and mission coordination that could prevent another mass casualty event.
My family might call me a worthless failure, but they had no idea what kind of failure they were dealing with, or how many lives had been saved by my invisible contributions to global security. That knowledge would have to be enough, at least for now, because the alternative was a world where chemical weapons flowed freely across international borders and babies like Sophia grew up in constant danger from threats their parents couldn't imagine. I'd chosen to stand guard against those nightmares, even if it meant being dismissed by the very people I was protecting. The work continued, as it always did, in the space between what people knew and what they needed to believe. And I continued with it, driven by love for a niece who'd never know her aunt had helped keep the world safe enough for her to sleep peacefully in her mother's arms.
The emergency alert came through at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Emma's wedding. I was already awake, reviewing intelligence reports from our assets in the Balkans, when every secure phone in my apartment began buzzing simultaneously. The pattern was unmistakable, a code red alert that meant imminent threat to American lives on domestic soil. I was dressed and in my car within 3 minutes, racing through empty streets toward Langley while encrypted radio traffic filled my earpiece. The fragments of information were terrifying in their implications. Multiple chemical weapons cells operating simultaneously across the eastern seaboard. Coordinated attacks planned from major water treatment facilities. Timeline measured in hours, not days. The SIF was chaos when I arrived. Analysts pulling all-nighters to track the scope of what appeared to be the largest domestic terrorism plot since 9/11. The Kazakhstan facility we'd neutralized 2 months earlier had been just the beginning, a test run for something much larger and more devastating. The real weapons production had been happening in scattered locations across 3 continents, coordinated through encrypted channels that had taken our best cryptographers weeks to penetrate. Sarah met me at the security checkpoint, her face grim in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "How bad is it?" I asked, though her expression already told me everything I needed to know. "Worse than anything we've modeled," she replied, handing me a tablet loaded with real-time intelligence updates. 12 cells, coordinated strikes on water systems serving 40 million people. The toxins are already in position, just waiting for the signal to deploy. I scanned the tactical assessment as we walked toward the command center, my blood turning to ice as I recognized the target locations: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. The population centers where my family lived, where millions of innocent people went about their daily routines with no idea that death was being prepared for them in unmarked vehicles in abandoned warehouses. Emma and James had returned from their honeymoon the week before, settling into their new house just outside Philadelphia with baby Sophia. They'd sent photos of the nursery they'd finished setting up, completely absorbed in their domestic bliss, while terrorist cells prepared to poison the water supply that fed their neighborhood. The irony was staggering, that my family could dismiss my work while benefiting from the intelligence networks that stood between them and unimaginable horror. The command center buzzed with controlled urgency, dozens of analysts coordinating with law enforcement agencies and military units to track down the chemical weapon cells before they could execute their plan. FBI tactical teams were mobilizing in 6 cities, but they needed precise locations and timing to prevent a catastrophic deployment of toxins that could kill millions. My workstation had been prepared with every piece of intelligence we'd gathered over the past 3 months, cross-referenced with financial records, communications intercepts, and surveillance footage from suspected locations. The pattern that emerged was terrifyingly sophisticated, a network that had been operating under our noses for years while maintaining perfect operational security. Colonel Martinez appeared beside my desk at 0400, carrying coffee that actually tasted decent for once, and a folder marked with classification levels that made my security clearance feel inadequate. "We need targeting packages for 12 locations in 6 hours, she said, without preamble. "And we need them to be perfect, because we're only going to get one chance at this." 6 hours to analyze a terrorist network that had taken years to establish, using intelligence gathered from sources that had risked their lives to penetrate organizations that killed people for asking the wrong questions? It was an impossible timeline under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. This was the scenario that justified every classified dollar spent on intelligence capabilities, every analyst who'd chosen service over recognition, every operation that had remained hidden from public view. I dove into the data with the focused intensity that came from knowing that failure meant watching cities die.
Financial transactions led to shell companies that led to real estate purchases that led to chemical storage facilities hidden in industrial parks. Personnel records revealed connections between seemingly unrelated individuals who'd traveled identical routes and made identical purchases at hardware stores scattered across multiple states. The first breakthrough came at 0630, when pattern analysis revealed that all 12 cells were using the same supplier for detonation devices, a company that existed only as a post office box and a bank account linked to Iranian intelligence services. The second breakthrough came 2 hours later when facial recognition software connected the cell leaders to a training camp in Libya that had been destroyed by airstrikes 3 months earlier. By 0900, I had constructed targeting packages that identified not just the locations of the chemical weapons, but the specific timing for the planned attacks and the backup protocols the cells would use if their primary plan was disrupted. The intelligence picture was comprehensive enough to coordinate simultaneous raids that would prevent any of the cells from triggering their weapons in response to law enforcement action against the others. Sarah reviewed my analysis with the kind of focused attention that meant lives hung in the balance of every recommendation I'd made. "Confidence level?" she asked, though we both knew that anything less than absolute certainty could result in missed targets and mass casualties. 97% on locations, 85% on timing, 92% on backup protocols, I replied, already beginning the process of briefing packages for the tactical teams that would execute the raids. The cells are compartmentalized, but they're using identical operational procedures that suggest central coordination. She nodded grimly, reaching for the secure phone that would connect her to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. Within minutes, my analysis would be distributed to assault teams in 6 cities, influencing tactical decisions that would either prevent the largest domestic terrorism attack in American history or fail catastrophically if my intelligence was wrong. The raids launched simultaneously at 1100 hours, coordinated down to the second to prevent any cell from triggering their weapons in response to law enforcement action against the others. I monitored the operations through encrypted radio traffic, providing real-time updates as tactical teams penetrated the locations I had identified and secured chemical weapons that could have killed millions. Philadelphia was the third location hit, a warehouse in an industrial district just 15 miles from Emma and James's new house. The tactical team found enough weaponized toxins to contaminate the water supply for the entire metropolitan area, along with detailed maps showing optimal deployment points and title charts for maximizing civilian casualties. Emma would never know how close she had come to watching her baby die from poisoned water, never understand that her sister's boring government job had literally saved her family's life. All 12 cells were neutralized within 47 minutes, their weapons secured and their personnel arrested before any of the chemical agents could be deployed. The coordinated raids were executed with precision that left no room for the terrorists to trigger their backup protocols or communicate warnings to cells in other cities. But my secure phone started buzzing again before the all-clear signal had even been transmitted. Another crisis developing in real time as our success against the domestic cells revealed intelligence about related operations in Europe and Asia. The terrorist network was larger than we had initially assessed, with active cells in London, Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo preparing similar attacks against civilian water supplies. I was pulling up new databases to begin analysis of the international connections when my personal phone rang, Emma's name appearing on the screen, with a photo of Sophia in her high chair covered in what looked like strained carrots. The image was so normal, so perfectly domestic, that it took me a moment to process the disconnect between my two worlds. "Hey, can you talk?" Emma's voice carried a note of stress that immediately put me on alert. "I know you're probably busy with work, but I need a favor." Work. She had no idea that my work had just prevented her daughter from being poisoned by chemical weapons deployed by terrorist cells that had been operating 15 miles from her house. She thought I processed paperwork in some generic government building, not that I analyzed threats that could eliminate entire cities. "What's going on?"
I asked, minimizing the intelligence feeds to focus on whatever domestic crisis she was experiencing. After 36 hours of preventing mass casualties, I could spare a few minutes for family obligations. James's parents were supposed to watch Sophia tonight so we could go to dinner, but his mom came down with something, and we can't find another babysitter on short notice, she explained, her voice carrying that familiar tone of barely contained frustration. I know it's last minute, but could you possibly cover for us? We haven't been out together since before the wedding, and the restaurant reservation was really hard to get. The request was so ordinary, so removed from the life and death decisions I'd been making all morning, that I almost laughed. She was asking me to babysit on the same day I'd helped prevent her city from being contaminated with chemical weapons. The irony was overwhelming, but there was also something touching about her trust, even if it was based on seeing me as harmless and available rather than capable and essential. Of course, I said, already calculating how to manage both the international crisis and an evening of childcare. What time do you need me there? The relief in her voice was audible. Really? Oh my God, thank you so much. Could you be here by 6? We have a 7:30 reservation and I still need time to get ready. I glanced at the intelligence feeds still running across my monitors, new information streaming in about terrorist cells in 4 countries. The international analysis would take hours to complete, but most of it could be done remotely, using secure connections from my laptop. I'll be there at 6, I confirmed, already planning how to coordinate with European intelligence services while keeping a 6-month-old baby entertained. Emma's gratitude was genuine, though it came with the familiar undertone of surprise that I'd proven useful for something. You're a lifesaver, Zara. I know this isn't really your thing, but Sophia loves you, and we really need this night out. Not my thing. If only she knew that my thing involved literally saving lives, that I'd spent the morning preventing mass casualties while she worried about restaurant reservations. But that was the nature of classified work, the burden of protecting people who could never know what you'd done on their behalf. I finished the immediate analysis and prepared remote access protocols that would let me continue working from Emma's house, then drove through afternoon traffic toward the suburban neighborhood where my family lived in blissful ignorance of the dangers that had been neutralized just hours earlier. Emma answered the door in a black cocktail dress, looking radiant in the way that came from successful domestic management and social validation. James appeared behind her in a navy blazer, checking his watch with the kind of mild impatience that suggested this evening out was very important to their relationship dynamic. Sophia was in her bouncy seat by the living room window, babbling happily at dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. She'd grown noticeably even in the few weeks since the wedding, her dark hair thicker and her expressions more alert. When she saw me, her face lit up with the kind of pure joy that made everything else fade into background noise. She's been fed and changed, Emma said, gathering her purse and car keys with efficient movements. Bottles are in the fridge if she gets hungry, though she probably won't need one before we get back. Bedtime routine starts at 8:30, bath first, then story time. Then she usually goes down pretty easily. I nodded, accepting the detailed instructions while mentally preparing to coordinate international counterterrorism operations during bath time. How late do you think you'll be? Hopefully not past 10:30, James replied, checking his phone for traffic updates. The restaurant's only 20 minutes away, but you know how these places can be with timing. They left in a whirlwind of final instructions and grateful thanks, completely unaware that they were entrusting their daughter to someone who'd spent the morning preventing their city from being contaminated with chemical weapons. I settled into the familiar rhythm of childcare, entertaining Sophia with peekaboo games, while my laptop processed intelligence feeds from counterparts in London and Berlin. The international picture was even more complex than the domestic operation, with terrorist cells using diplomatic pouches and cultural exchange programs to move chemical weapons precursors across international borders. My analysis identified patterns that linked the American plot to similar operations targeting European capitals, all coordinated through the same Iranian intelligence networks that had funded the weapons development. Sophia was remarkably good company for classified work, content to sit in her high chair examining colorful toys while I tracked financial flows and personnel movements across multiple databases. She occasionally looked up at me with curious eyes, as if she sensed something important was happening but couldn't quite understand what it meant. The breakthrough came at 8:15, just as I was starting Sophia's bedtime routine.
Pattern analysis revealed that the European cells were planning to execute their attacks during morning rush hour, when water consumption would be highest and emergency response would be most difficult to coordinate. The timeline was even tighter than it had been for the domestic operation, with less than 12 hours to coordinate raids in 4 countries. I managed to run Sophia's bath one-handed while typing urgent intelligence updates with the other, coordinating with analysts at GCHQ and BND who were working the same patterns from their perspectives. The baby seemed to enjoy the multitasking, splashing happily in her bath while international counterterrorism operations unfolded on secure channels. By the time Emma and James returned at 10:45, slightly tipsy from wine and glowing with the satisfaction of a successful evening out, I had helped coordinate tactical operations that would prevent chemical weapons attacks in 4 European capitals. Sophia was sleeping peacefully in her crib, having fallen asleep during a story about brave rabbits, while her aunt helped organize operations that would keep millions of people safe. "How was she?" Emma asked, settling onto the couch with the kind of relaxed contentment that came from knowing your child had been well cared for. "Perfect," I replied, closing my laptop after sending final intelligence updates to European counterparts who would execute raids at dawn. She went down right on schedule after her bath and story. James appeared from the kitchen with glasses of water, his face flushed with wine and satisfaction. "We really appreciate this, Zara. I know babysitting isn't exactly exciting, but it meant a lot to us to have someone we trust with Sophia." Trust. They trusted me with their daughter's physical safety while having no idea that I spent my professional life protecting her from threats they couldn't imagine. The contrast was almost unbearable, watching them navigate domestic concerns while remaining completely oblivious to the international crisis that had been unfolding around them. My secure phone buzzed with an update from London as I was gathering my things to leave. The European raids had been successful, 4 more chemical weapons cells neutralized before they could contaminate water supplies serving 20 million people. Sophia would grow up in a world where terrorist plots were disrupted before they could unfold, where intelligence analysts worked around the clock to maintain the illusion that such threats didn't exist. But she'd also grow up believing her aunt was someone who babysat occasionally and worked some boring government job, someone who'd never achieved anything particularly impressive or worthy of family recognition. The truth would remain classified at levels her parents couldn't imagine, another invisible victory in a career built on protecting people who could never know what had been done on their behalf.
I drove home through quiet suburban streets, past houses where families slept peacefully in beds they didn't know had been safe from chemical weapons attacks only because analysts like me had worked around the clock to identify and neutralize threats before they became operational. The normal world continued its normal rhythms, blissfully ignorant of the extraordinary efforts required to maintain that normalcy. 3 weeks later, the commendation ceremony took place in a classified facility that my family would never see. The president himself presented medals to the analysts and operatives who had prevented the largest coordinated terrorist attack in modern history, though the ceremony would never appear in any public records, and the heroes would never be acknowledged outside the intelligence community. I stood at attention in my dress uniform as senior officials praised work that would remain forever secret, protecting people who would never know our names or understand what we'd sacrificed on their behalf. The medal was beautiful, crafted from precious metals and inscribed with words about valor and service, but it would join the others in my classified personnel file, invisible to the family members who measured success through conventional metrics. Sarah stood beside me as the ceremony concluded, both of us wearing medals that our families would never see for work they'd never understand. "Your sister still thinks you process paperwork?" she asked quietly as we walked toward the parking garage. I nodded, thinking about Sophia sleeping peacefully in her crib while chemical weapons were being neutralized across multiple continents. "Some truths are too dangerous to share," I replied, though part of me wondered what it would be like to have just one person in my family understand the real value of the work I did. The secure phone buzzed again as I reached my car,
Another crisis developing somewhere in the world that required immediate analysis. I answered with professional efficiency, already shifting back into the focused mindset that allowed me to function as a guardian in shadows, protecting people who would never know I existed. Emma sent another photo that evening, Sophia taking her first tentative steps between the coffee table and the couch. The caption read, "She's growing so fast. Thanks again for babysitting last week. You're the best backup aunt ever." Backup aunt? If only she knew that her backup aunt had helped prevent multiple cities from being poisoned with chemical weapons, that the boring government job involved coordinating operations that kept babies like Sophia safe from threats their parents couldn't imagine. But that knowledge would remain classified, another secret I'd carry alone, while my family continued to see me as the disappointing sister who'd never quite managed to get her life together. The phone call lasted an hour, coordinating analysis of new threats that were already developing in regions where old ones had been eliminated. This was the nature of the work, an endless cycle of invisible victories against enemies who adapted and evolved but never surrendered their intention to cause mass casualties among civilian populations. I fell asleep thinking about Sophia's first steps, and about all the steps she'd be able to take in a world kept safe by people she'd never meet, protected by guardians she'd never know existed. Some love was meant to remain invisible, some service was meant to go unrecognized, and some sisters were meant to stand watch in shadows while others lived in the light. The silence in the hospital waiting room felt different from the operational silence I was accustomed to at work. This wasn't the focused quiet of analysts processing critical intelligence, but the hollow emptiness that came with uncertainty and fear. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing the casual clothes I'd thrown on when Emma's panicked call had woken me at 3 a.m. "Sophia's in the emergency room," she'd sobbed into the phone, her voice breaking with terror. "She won't stop crying, and her fever is so high, and the doctors don't know what's wrong, and James is falling apart, and I don't know what to do." I'd been at the hospital within 20 minutes, arriving to find Emma pacing the pediatric waiting area, while James sat hunched over in a corner chair, his face buried in his hands. The confident couple from the wedding had vanished, replaced by two frightened parents watching their 6-month-old daughter fight something the medical staff couldn't immediately identify. "Any updates?" I asked Emma, who looked like she hadn't slept in days despite it being only 6 hours since her initial call. Her hair hung in unwashed strings around her pale face, and her clothes were the same ones she'd been wearing when the crisis began. She shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "They're running more tests, but her temperature keeps spiking and she's having trouble breathing, and the doctors keep using words like unusual presentation and atypical symptoms, and I know that means they don't know what's happening to her." James looked up at the sound of our voices, his eyes red and hollow. "The pediatrician said he's never seen anything quite like this. Her blood work shows some kind of toxin exposure, but they can't identify what kind or how she was exposed to it." Toxin exposure. The words hit me like ice water, activating analytical pathways that had been dormant during my transition from professional crisis management to family support. I'd spent the last 18 months tracking chemical weapons programs and analyzing poison delivery systems, and now those same analytical skills were suddenly terrifyingly relevant to my niece's medical emergency. "What kind of toxin markers are they finding?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual while my mind raced through possibilities that were too horrible to consider. Emma pulled out her phone and scrolled through notes she'd been taking during conversations with medical staff. Something called elevated acetylcholine esterase inhibition, and they mentioned organophosphate compounds, but they said it doesn't match any common pesticide exposures. My blood turned to ice. Acetylcholinesterase inhibitors were the foundation of nerve agent toxicology, the mechanism by which chemical weapons disrupted the nervous system and caused respiratory failure. Organophosphate compounds were precursors for VX gas and other military-grade toxins, the same substances I'd been tracking through terrorist networks for months. But this was impossible. Sophia was a 6-month-old baby living in suburban Philadelphia, not a target in some international espionage operation. There had to be a conventional explanation,
some household chemical or medication interaction that was producing similar symptoms. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. Have they considered environmental factors? I asked, still trying to maintain the appearance of concerned aunt rather than intelligence analyst. New cleaning products, lawn treatments, anything that might have changed recently in her environment? James shook his head. We've been through everything with the doctors. No new products, no pest control, no construction or renovation work, nothing that would explain chemical exposure, especially not the specific compounds they're detecting. A terrible suspicion was beginning to form in my mind, a connection between Sophia's symptoms and the intelligence briefings I'd been receiving about residual threats from the chemical weapons network we'd disrupted months earlier. During the raids, we'd discovered that some of the terrorists had been conducting small-scale field tests of their toxins, using trace amounts to verify effectiveness before scaling up to mass deployment. What if one of those field tests had involved contaminating everyday products that could end up in civilian homes? What if the terrorists had been using innocent families as unknowing test subjects, gathering data on poison effectiveness while maintaining plausible deniability about accidental exposures? My secure phone was in my car, and along with access codes that could connect me to databases containing detailed information about the chemical weapons we'd confiscated months ago. But I couldn't access that information without revealing my real job to Emma and James, and that revelation could put them in danger if there were still active terrorist cells monitoring for intelligence leaks.
Dr. Sarah Patel appeared in the waiting room doorway, her expression serious, but not panicked. She was young for a pediatric emergency medicine specialist, probably early 30s, with the kind of focused competence that came from years of treating critically ill children under extreme pressure. I have some updates on Sophia's condition, she said, gesturing for us to follow her to a quiet consultation area. The good news is that her vital signs have stabilized somewhat, and we've been able to reduce her fever. The concerning news is that the toxicology results confirm exposure to a very unusual compound that we're having difficulty identifying precisely. Emma grabbed my hand, her grip tight enough to leave marks. Is she going to be okay? She whispered, the words barely audible. Dr. Patel's expression softened slightly. We're treating her symptoms aggressively, and infants are often remarkably resilient when they receive proper care quickly. But I'll be honest with you, this particular toxin profile is unlike anything in our standard treatment protocols. We're consulting with specialists at the CDC and the Poison Control Center to develop the most effective approach. The CDC. If federal health authorities were being consulted, it meant the medical staff suspected something more serious than accidental household exposure. My mind raced through protocols for responding to suspected bioterrorism incidents, procedures I knew from the operational side, but had never imagined would apply to my own family. What kind of specialists are you consulting with? I asked, hoping to gather more information without revealing why I was asking such specific questions. Toxicologists with experience in unusual chemical exposures, and unfortunately, some experts in potential bioterrorism incidents, Dr. Patel replied carefully. The compound profile has some characteristics that suggest it might be synthetic rather than naturally occurring, which means we need to consider the possibility of intentional contamination. James went completely white, his hand moving instinctively to cover his mouth. Emma made a small choking sound, the implications of Dr. Patel's words hitting her like physical blows. Their baby wasn't just sick. She might be the victim of a deliberate attack designed to test chemical weapons on innocent civilians. I need to make a phone call, I said quietly, standing up from my chair with movements that felt disconnected from my body. I'll be right back. Emma nodded absently, her attention focused entirely on Dr. Patel's explanation of treatment protocols and monitoring procedures. James was asking questions about prognosis and recovery timelines, his voice shaky but determined. Neither of them noticed that I was walking toward the hospital's main entrance with purpose that had nothing to do with getting fresh air. My secure phone connected to Colonel Martinez's direct line on the second ring, despite the early morning hour. Sarah had been coordinating counterterrorism operations for 20 years, and she was accustomed to crisis calls that couldn't wait for normal business hours. Martinez here, her voice was alert and professional, suggesting she'd been awake despite the time. "Colonel, this is Major Chen,"
I said, walking to a secluded area of the hospital parking garage where our conversation couldn't be overheard. I need immediate access to the chemical analysis reports from the Philadelphia raid, specifically any intelligence about field testing or experimental deployment. There was a brief pause, during which I could hear Sarah processing the urgency in my voice and the unusual nature of my request. "Is this related to an active operation?" she asked carefully. "It's related to my 6-month-old niece being in the emergency room with organophosphate poisoning that matches the toxin profiles from our confiscated chemical weapons. The doctors are consulting with CDC specialists because they think it might be bioterrorism." Another pause, longer this time. "Jesus Christ, Sarah said quietly. "Are you certain about the connection? The symptoms match exactly, and the toxicology results are showing compounds that don't exist in civilian applications. Either this is the most incredible coincidence in medical history, or someone from that network managed to test their weapons on my family." Sarah's voice shifted into operational mode, the tone she used when lives hung in the balance and every decision mattered. "I'm accessing the files now. Can you receive encrypted data at your current location?" I looked around the parking garage, calculating signal strength and security risks. "Negative, but I can be at a secure location in 40 minutes if you can delay any medical decisions until I can review the intelligence." "Negative on delaying medical treatment," Sarah replied firmly. "Your niece's health takes priority over operational security. I'm going to transmit what I can over this connection, and you're going to have to make judgment calls about what information to share with medical staff." The data started flowing through my secure phone 30 seconds later. Intelligence reports that painted a terrifying picture of exactly what had happened to Sophia. The Philadelphia terrorist cell had been conducting small-scale tests of their chemical weapons by contaminating consumer products that would be purchased by unsuspecting families. Baby formula, cleaning supplies, toys, anything that would provide exposure data while maintaining plausible deniability about accidental contamination. The products were distributed through normal retail channels with no way for consumers to detect the contamination until symptoms appeared. The terrorists had been collecting data on poison effectiveness, dosage calculations, and symptom progression using innocent children as test subjects for weapons designed to kill thousands of people. Sophia had been poisoned deliberately, selected randomly as a data point in an experiment designed to perfect mass murder techniques. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The intersection of my professional nightmare and personal love, creating a rage so pure and focused that I had to lean against a concrete pillar to keep from collapsing. But rage was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. Sophia needed specific medical treatment that would only be effective if doctors understood exactly what toxin they were treating, and that information existed only in classified intelligence reports that I wasn't supposed to possess and couldn't legally share with civilian medical staff. I walked back into the hospital with Sarah's voice still in my earpiece, coordinating with medical experts who had security clearances high enough to consult on suspected bioterrorism incidents.
Within 20 minutes, Dr. Patel was receiving detailed treatment protocols that had been developed specifically for the chemical agents confiscated during our raids. "This is remarkable," Dr. Patel said as she reviewed the treatment information on her secure tablet. "These protocols are incredibly specific, almost like they were developed for this exact toxin profile. How did the CDC specialists identify the compound so quickly?" I met her eyes steadily, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes federal agencies have more information about potential threats than they can share publicly," I said. "The important thing is that Sophia gets the right treatment." The antidote was administered within an hour, a combination of specialized medications that had been developed by military researchers specifically to counter the chemical weapons we'd been tracking. Sophia's condition began improving almost immediately, her breathing becoming less labored and her fever dropping to manageable levels. Emma cried with relief when Dr. Patel announced that Sophia was going to make a full recovery, but her tears were mixed with confusion about how her baby had been exposed to such dangerous chemicals. James demanded answers about where the toxins had come from, what products had been contaminated, whether other children were at risk. The official investigation that followed identified 13 consumer products that had been contaminated by the terrorist cell, affecting 47 children across 3 states before the pattern was discovered. The story made national news for exactly 1 news cycle before being quietly suppressed by federal authorities who didn't want to cause panic about the security of consumer products. But I knew the real story. the classified version that would never appear in public reports. Sophia hadn't been randomly victimized by product tampering. She'd been deliberately targeted as part of a chemical weapons testing program designed to kill thousands of people. Her exposure had been calculated, measured, documented by terrorists who saw her as nothing more than experimental data. The rage I'd felt in the parking garage transformed into something colder and more focused during the weeks that followed. I threw myself into tracking down the remaining members of the chemical weapons network, working 18-hour days to identify and eliminate every person who had participated in using children as test subjects for mass murder weapons. Sarah tried to counsel me about professional objectivity and the dangers of personal involvement in operational decisions, but there was nothing objective about watching your 6-month-old niece fight for her life because terrorists had chosen her as a guinea pig for chemical weapons designed to kill babies just like her. The remaining terrorist cells were neutralized within 6 weeks, their operations dismantled through intelligence work that exceeded anything I had accomplished in my previous career. Every person who had participated in the testing program was identified, tracked, and eliminated through methods that would remain forever classified. Emma and James never learned the full truth about what had happened to their daughter. They believed she'd been the victim of random product tampering, a tragic accident that could have happened to any family. They increased their home security and became more cautious about consumer products, but they never understood that their baby had been deliberately targeted by people who wanted to perfect techniques for killing children. I couldn't tell them the truth without revealing my real job and potentially putting them in greater danger. So I remained their backup aunt, the sister who'd been helpful during a medical crisis but hadn't really done anything extraordinary. They had no idea that their backup aunt had hunted down every person responsible for poisoning their child and ensured that none of them would ever threaten another family. Sophia recovered completely, developing into a bright and energetic toddler with no lasting effects from her exposure to chemical weapons. She learned to walk and talk and play with toys, blissfully unaware that her aunt had declared war on an entire terrorist network to protect her from people who saw her as an expendable test subject for chemical weapons. Emma sent regular photos and videos documenting Sophia's milestones with the proud devotion of a mother who'd nearly lost her child and never wanted to take normal development for granted. First words, first steps, first attempts at eating solid food, all of it precious and miraculous because we'd come so close to losing it all. But Emma still saw me as the disappointing sister who worked some boring government job and couldn't manage to achieve anything particularly impressive. She had no idea that her boring sister had spent months hunting down the people who'd poisoned her daughter, or that the safety she took for granted was maintained by analysts who chose service over recognition. The commendation for dismantling the chemical weapons testing network joined the others in my classified personnel file, another invisible victory in a career built on protecting people who would never know what had been done on their behalf. The president himself signed the citation, though the ceremony took place in a facility that my family would never see, and the achievement would never appear on any public record. I stood at attention in my dress uniform as senior officials praised work that would remain forever secret, protecting children like Sophia from people who wanted to use them as experimental subjects for mass murder weapons. The medal was beautiful, but it would join the others in my classified personnel file, invisible to the family members who measured success through conventional metrics. Sarah stood beside me as the ceremony concluded, both of us wearing medals that our families would never see for work that they'd never understand. "She's walking now, isn't she?" she asked quietly as we walked toward the parking garage, referring to the photos of Sophia I'd shown her during our operational briefings. I nodded, thinking about the video Emma had sent that morning of Sophia taking her first independent steps between the coffee table and the couch. 15 months old and fearless, I replied. She has no idea how close she came to never learning to walk. The secure phone buzzed again as I reached my car, another crisis developing somewhere in the world that required immediate analysis. I answered with professional efficiency, already shifting back into the focused mindset that allowed me to function as a guardian in the shadows, protecting children like Sophia from people who wanted to hurt them. Emma would never know that her backup aunt had declared war on an entire terrorist network to protect her daughter, or that the boring government job involved hunting down people who used babies as test subjects for chemical weapons. But Sophia would grow up safe and loved, taking her first steps in a world kept secure by people she'd never meet, protected by guardians she'd never know existed. Some love was meant to remain invisible, some service was meant to go unrecognized, and some aunts were meant to stand watch in shadows while others lived in the light. The work continued, as it always did,
Driven by love for a niece who would never know her aunt helped keep the world safe enough for her to take her first steps without fear.